Have you ever been treated like you were nothing? Like your voice didn't matter? Like you were just a shadow in the corner of the room while everyone else lived in the spotlight? Have you ever felt that burning sensation in your chest when people talk over you, ignore your ideas, dismiss your dreams as if they were worthless fantasies? Well, let me tell you something that will shake you to your core. What if I told you that the person they thought was weak, insignificant, and powerless was actually the one holding all the cards? What if the quiet one they overlooked was secretly controlling their entire future without them even knowing it? This is my story, and I promise you by the end of this you'll never look at the underdog the same way again. My name doesn't matter, but what matters is what happened to me, what I discovered about myself, and how I turned the tables on everyone who ever doubted me. This isn't just a revenge story, though there's definitely some satisfaction involved. This is about transformation, about finding your true power when everyone around you is convinced you have none. I remember the exact moment when I realized I was tired of being invisible. It was a Tuesday afternoon and I was sitting in yet another meeting at work, where my ideas were being stolen, repackaged, and presented by someone else as their own brilliant insights. I had stopped raising my hand months ago because what was the point? Every time I spoke, there were those patronizing smiles, those subtle eye rolls, those interruptions that made it clear my contributions weren't valued. My manager, Richard, had this particular way of looking through me, as if I were made of glass, as if my presence was barely worth acknowledging except when he needed someone to dump extra work on. And I took it, day after day, week after week, year after year. I took it all. The dismissive comments, the credit stolen, the promotions that went to people who had half my skills but twice my confidence. I smile now thinking about how wrong they all were, how completely and utterly blind they were to what was happening right under their noses. But back then, in those dark months when I felt like I was drowning in my own insignificance, I didn't know that everything was about to change. I didn't know that I was actually building something powerful, something that would eventually give me complete control over the very people who treated me like I was disposable. You see, I had a gift that nobody recognized. While they were all busy playing office politics, networking at happy hours, and brown-nosing the executives, I was doing something different. I was learning. I was observing. I was quietly becoming indispensable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. I had started 5 years earlier as a junior analyst in a mid-sized tech company that was struggling to compete with the industry giants. The company had potential. Everyone said so, but they were making critical mistakes in their data management and strategic planning. Nobody wanted to deal with the boring back-end stuff, the databases, the systems architecture, the automation processes that made everything run smoothly. That was considered grunt work, beneath the attention of the rising stars who were focused on presentations and client meetings. So that became my domain. While everyone else was fighting over who got to pitch to clients, I was building the infrastructure that the entire company relied on. At first, it was just my job, nothing special, but then I started noticing things. I started seeing patterns in how information flowed through the organization, how decisions were made, how power was actually distributed versus how it appeared to be distributed. I realized that the people at the top, the ones everyone was trying to impress, they didn't actually understand how their own company worked at the technical level. They relied completely on the systems I was building and maintaining. And that's when something shifted in my mind. That's when I started to see opportunity where others saw only tedious work. I began to understand that knowledge is power, but specialized knowledge that nobody else has is ultimate power. So I made a decision. Instead of trying to climb the ladder the traditional way, instead of competing for attention and recognition, I would become irreplaceable in the shadows. I would become the person who held all the keys, who understood all the systems, who could make things work or make things fail with just a few keystrokes. Does that sound calculating? Maybe it was. But you have to understand, I wasn't trying to sabotage anyone or hurt the company. I was simply protecting myself, creating job security in a world where I had learned that being nice and working hard wasn't enough. I had watched too many good people get fired, too many loyal employees get tossed aside when budget cuts came around. I wasn't going to be one of them. The first 3 years were the hardest. I was working late nights and weekends, not because anyone asked me to, but because I was teaching myself everything I could about our systems, about data analytics, about artificial intelligence and machine learning, before those became the buzzwords they are today. I was building automated processes that saved the company hundreds of hours of work every month. but I built them in ways that only I fully understood. I documented everything, sure, but my documentation was complex, technical, and honestly, written in a way that would take someone months to fully comprehend if they tried to take over my work. I became the spider at the center of a web that nobody else could see. Every major department relied on the dashboards I created, the reports I generated, the systems I maintained. The sales team needed my analytics to know which clients to target. The marketing team needed my data to understand campaign performance. The executives needed my forecasts to make strategic decisions. The finance team needed my automated processes to close the books each month. And I made sure that I was always helpful, always available, always solving problems quietly and efficiently. People started to appreciate me in a distant kind of way, like you appreciate your plumber when your pipes work, but never really think about them until something goes wrong. But I still wasn't respected, not really. I was still the quiet one, the technical person, the worker bee. Richard, my manager, still took credit for my work. The executive team still didn't know my name. My colleagues still talked over me in meetings. And you know what? I let them. Because while they were all looking at the surface, fighting over titles and corner offices, I was building real power underneath. I was becoming the foundation that the entire building stood on, and they didn't even realize it. Have you ever felt underestimated like this? Have you ever been in a position where people just didn't see your worth? Comment below and let me know, because I want to hear your stories too. This journey I'm sharing with you, it's not just mine, it's something so many of us experience. And maybe, just maybe, my story will give you hope or ideas for your own situation. Now let me tell you about the years that followed. The years where I perfected my craft and solidified my position, without anyone understanding what was happening. Those were strange years, filled with this odd mixture of frustration and secret satisfaction. On the surface, my life looked exactly the same. I was still the quiet analyst who came in early, stayed late, and rarely spoke up in meetings. My salary increased modestly, just enough to keep pace with inflation and retain me as a reliable employee, but nothing spectacular. I watched as people who had joined the company after me got promoted past me, celebrated at company-wide meetings, given awards and recognition. I watched as Richard continued to present my insights as his own, continued to take credit for the systems I built, continued to treat me like a convenient tool rather than a valued team member. And every single time it happened, every time someone else got the applause for work I had done, I felt that familiar burn of resentment. But I also felt something else, something that grew stronger with each passing month. I felt a quiet confidence, a secret knowledge that they were all dancing on a stage I had built, and I could change the music anytime I wanted. During this period, I became obsessive about understanding every single aspect of our company's operations. I wasn't just maintaining the systems anymore, I was expanding them, integrating them, creating dependencies that nobody requested but everyone came to rely on. I built an AI-powered forecasting model that became the foundation for all our quarterly planning. I created an automated client management system that our entire sales force depended on. I developed a custom analytics platform that gave our executives real-time insights into company performance, making them look brilliant in board meetings when they could instantly answer any question about our metrics. The beautiful irony was that they all thought these were just company tools, infrastructure that belonged to the organization. They didn't realize that I had built these systems in such a specific way, with my own proprietary algorithms, my own unique architecture, that replacing me would be a nightmare. I wasn't doing anything illegal or unethical. I want to be clear about that. I was just very, very good at my job, and very strategic about how I did it. I made myself the keystone of the entire operation. You know what a keystone is, right? It's that one stone at the top of an arch that holds everything else in place. Remove it, and the whole structure collapses. That's what I became, except nobody realized it because they were all too busy looking at the impressive arch and not thinking about what held it together. My social life during these years was practically non-existent. I had a few friends outside of work, people who knew me from college or childhood, but I had become so focused on my secret project of building indispensability that I had little time or energy for maintaining relationships. My family worried about me, asked why I was working so hard at a job where I seemed to be going nowhere. My mother would say things like, "Honey, you're so talented. Why don't you look for a job where they appreciate you?" And I would just smile and tell her I was fine, that I liked my work, that I was learning a lot. How could I explain to her what I was really doing? How could I tell her that I was engaged in this elaborate chess game where I was positioning myself for a checkmate that might take years to arrive? She wouldn't have understood. Nobody would have understood. There were moments of doubt, I'll admit that. Moments when I wondered if I was wasting my life, if I should just quit and find a place where I would be valued from the start. There were nights when I sat alone in my apartment, eating takeout in front of my computer, wondering if this was all worth it. Was I missing out on life while I pursued this strange vindication? Was I becoming bitter and twisted by my resentment? These questions haunted me sometimes late at night when the only sound was the hum of my laptop and the occasional siren outside my window. But then Monday would come, and I would walk into that office and Richard would ignore me or dismiss me or take credit for something I had done, and that fire would ignite again. That determination would solidify. No, I wasn't wasting my time. I was building something important, something powerful. I was creating a situation where they would finally have to see me, have to acknowledge me, have to understand that I wasn't weak at all. I want you to understand the psychological state I was in during these years. It wasn't healthy, probably. I was operating from a place of hurt and anger, channeling those emotions into productivity and strategic planning. I was living a double life in a way. The outer me was compliant, agreeable, forgettable. The inner me was calculating, observing, building. I studied every person in that office like they were characters in a story I was writing. I knew Richard's insecurities, how he felt threatened by anyone who seemed too competent, how he needed to be the smartest person in the room, even though he often wasn't. I knew our CEO, Margaret, who seemed confident and visionary in public but was actually terrified of making the wrong decision and constantly relied on data to validate her instincts. I knew the board members, the investors, the key clients. I understood the politics, the alliances, the hidden rivalries, and I understood how all of it flowed through the systems I controlled. Knowledge became my addiction. Every new thing I learned about the company, every new connection I understood, every new dependency I created, it gave me this rush of power. I was like a gardener who plants seeds that nobody else notices, knowing that years later those seeds will become massive trees that everyone relies on for shade. And I was patient. God, was I patient? Because I knew that my moment would come. I knew that eventually, circumstances would align in a way that would reveal the truth of the situation. I just had to wait, had to keep building, had to maintain my cover as the harmless, quiet worker who would never threaten anyone. The hidden preparation phase of my journey was probably the most intense period of my entire career, though nobody around me would have guessed it. To everyone else, I was just that reliable person who showed up every day, fixed problems, and never caused drama. But inside my mind, it was like I was training for the Olympics while everyone else thought I was just going for casual jogs. I started documenting everything in meticulous detail, not just the technical aspects of my work, but the business context, the decisions that were made based on my analyses, the outcomes that resulted from following or ignoring my recommendations. I kept personal logs, backed up on encrypted drives that I stored safely at home, chronicling the patterns I was seeing. I noted every time Richard took credit for my work, every time an executive made a successful decision based on data I provided, every time the company avoided a disaster because of a system I had built. I wasn't doing this out of paranoia or with any immediate plan to use it. I was doing it because I had learned that in the corporate world, memory is selective and truth is flexible. People remember what serves them, and they forget what doesn't. I wanted an objective record of my contributions, a timeline that couldn't be disputed if it ever came to that. During this time, I also started building my external credibility in ways that the company didn't know about. I began publishing technical articles under a pseudonym, sharing insights about data architecture and AI implementation that were based on my real work, but anonymized enough that it couldn't be traced back to our company. These articles started getting attention in tech circles. I was invited to speak at a few small conferences, which I did on weekends, always careful to maintain my anonymity at work. I was creating a professional reputation outside the walls of my company, establishing myself as an expert in my field, even if my own colleagues had no idea. Why was I doing this? Because I was building options. I was creating escape routes. I was making sure that if everything collapsed, if my gambit failed, if they somehow managed to push me out, I wouldn't be lost. I would have credentials, connections, and a reputation that would allow me to land somewhere else, Probably somewhere better. This was my safety net, woven thread by thread during lunch breaks and late nights when I should have been sleeping. I also started making strategic friendships with people who would matter later. Not the obvious power players in the office, but the people who actually made things happen. I befriended Janet in HR, who appreciated that I always submitted my paperwork on time and treated her with respect, unlike most people who saw HR as an obstacle. I built a relationship with Tom in IT security, who respected my technical knowledge and started consulting with me on various projects. I connected with Maria in finance, who relied on my automated reports and was always grateful when I customized dashboards for her team. These people weren't glamorous allies. They wouldn't help me climb the corporate ladder in the traditional sense. But they were the infrastructure people like me, and they understood things that the executives didn't. They saw how the company really worked, who was actually important versus who just seemed important. And crucially, they would remember who had been kind to them, who had made their jobs easier, who had treated them like human beings instead of service providers. The technology landscape was changing during these years too, and I made sure I was at the forefront of every important trend. When cloud computing started becoming essential, I taught myself everything about AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. When machine learning moved from academic curiosity to business imperative, I built models and algorithms that our company started depending on. When data privacy regulations like GDPR came into effect, I became our unofficial expert on compliance, building systems that protected us from legal liability. Every new skill I acquired, every new system I mastered, it added another layer of indispensability to my position. I was becoming not just useful, but irreplaceable. And the beautiful thing was that I wasn't doing it through politicking or self-promotion. I was doing it through pure competence and strategic thinking. I was making myself so valuable in practical terms that eventually, the value would have to be recognized. But the recognition wasn't coming, at least not in any meaningful way. I got the occasional good job in an email, the standard annual review that said I was meeting expectations, the modest raises that barely kept up with the cost of living. Meanwhile, Richard got promoted to senior director. Meanwhile, people who had joined years after me were becoming managers and team leads. Meanwhile, the company was growing, becoming more successful, winning industry awards, and expanding into new markets, all built on foundations I had created, but nobody acknowledged. The frustration was constant, a low-grade fever that never quite broke. Some days were worse than others. There was one particular incident that almost broke me, that almost made me quit everything and walk away from the careful trap I had been setting. We had landed a huge client, the kind of account that could transform the company from mid-sized player to industry leader. The executive team was ecstatic, and they held this big celebration meeting where Margaret, our CEO, talked about the incredible work that had gone into winning this client. She praised the sales team for their excellent pitch. She praised the marketing team for the compelling materials they had created. She praised Richard for the innovative analytics capabilities that had impressed the client during presentations. Richard stood there beaming, accepting congratulations from everyone, talking about the strategic vision behind the analytics platform, and I sat in the back of the room, invisible as always, watching this man take credit for years of my work, watching him bask in applause that should have been mine. The analytics capabilities that impressed the client, I built them. Every single dashboard, every predictive model, every automated insight, that was my work. Richard could barely understand how they functioned, let alone claim credit for creating them. But he did claim credit, confidently, and nobody questioned it because he was the director, and I was just an analyst whose name most people in that room probably didn't even know. I remember sitting there, my hands clenched in my lap, my jaw tight, feeling this overwhelming wave of rage and humiliation. This was it, I thought. This was the moment I should stand up and expose him. This was when I should speak up and claim what was mine. But I didn't. You know why? Because I had learned something important about power and timing. I had learned that you don't play your ace when you're angry. You play it when you're strategic. You wait for the moment when your move will have maximum impact, when the revelation will be undeniable, when the consequences will be permanent. So I sat there, and I swallowed my rage, and I smiled slightly, and I waited. Because I knew something they didn't know. I knew that they were becoming more dependent on me every single day. I knew that the systems I had built were now so integral to the company's operations that removing me would cause catastrophic disruption. I knew that I had documented everything, that I had proof of my contributions, that I had built external credibility that would support my claims, and most importantly, I knew that patience is a weapon that the impulsive never master. The first signs of power started revealing themselves in subtle ways that most people wouldn't have even noticed. But to me, they were like watching the first cracks appear in a dam that would eventually break. It started with small emergencies that only I could solve. Our primary forecasting system crashed one Monday morning, right before a major board presentation. Margaret was panicking because she needed updated numbers to present to the investors, and suddenly everyone was running around trying to figure out what was wrong. Richard was useless, of course, barking orders at people but having no actual technical understanding of what had failed. The IT team was scrambling, trying to diagnose the problem, but they didn't understand the custom architecture I had built. They were looking at surface-level issues, checking servers and network connections, not realizing that the problem was in the database optimization algorithms I had implemented. I let them struggle for about an hour. I know that sounds cruel, but I needed them to understand that they couldn't fix it without me. I needed them to feel the desperation, the helplessness of not having access to something they had come to depend on completely. Finally, Margaret's assistant found me in my office and breathlessly asked if I could help. I walked into the war room where the IT team and several executives had gathered, all looking stressed and frustrated. I calmly sat down at a computer, spent about 15 minutes diagnosing the issue, which was a corrupted data pipeline caused by an unexpected format change in one of our source systems, something I had built safeguards for, but that required manual intervention to restore. I fixed it efficiently, got the system back online, and delivered the updated forecast to Margaret with 10 minutes to spare before her presentation. The relief in that room was palpable. Margaret actually thanked me, said something like, "I don't know what we'd do without you," which was probably the most direct acknowledgement I had ever received from her. Richard tried to take some credit, saying something about his team being well prepared for emergencies, but for the first time, I saw a few people in the room glance at me, as if they were starting to understand that I was the one who had actually saved them. That incident was a turning point. Suddenly, people started paying attention when I walked into meetings. The IT team started deferring to me on technical decisions. Finance came directly to me when they needed custom reports instead of going through Richard. It was subtle, but the power dynamics were beginning to shift. I was no longer quite as invisible. But here's where it gets interesting. Once I had a taste of that acknowledgement, that recognition, I started to understand how I could manipulate these situations to my advantage. Not in a malicious way, but strategically. I realized that I could control the flow of information and access in ways that made me increasingly essential. So I started doing something clever. I began building more sophisticated systems with deliberate complexity. I created automation that saved the company enormous amounts of time and money, but I built it in such a way that I was the only one who could modify or troubleshoot it effectively. When people asked for documentation, I provided it, but my documentation was technically accurate yet practically incomprehensible to anyone who didn't have my specific background and knowledge. I wasn't sabotaging anything or creating unnecessary problems. Everything I built worked beautifully and provided real value, but it required me. That was the key. Every solution I implemented created a stronger dependency on my expertise. And as the company grew and took on bigger clients and more complex projects, that dependency grew exponentially. There was this moment, probably about 6 months after the board presentation incident, when I fully realized the extent of my influence. We were in a strategic planning meeting, one of those quarterly sessions where the executive team mapped out major initiatives for the next few months. Margaret was outlining an ambitious plan to expand into 3 new market segments simultaneously, and everyone was enthusiastically discussing sales strategies and marketing approaches. Then someone, I think it was our CFO David, asked the practical question that always gets overlooked in these enthusiastic planning sessions. He said, "Do we have the infrastructure to support this expansion? Will our systems scale appropriately?" The room got quiet for a moment, and I could see people looking at each other uncertainly. Richard started to speak, probably to offer some vague reassurance, but Margaret interrupted him and looked directly at me. She said my name, actually used my name in front of the entire executive team, and asked, "Can you evaluate what we would need to support this expansion and give us a realistic assessment?" This was it. This was the moment I had been building toward for years. Everyone in that room was suddenly focused on me, waiting for my answer. understanding that I held the key to whether their ambitious plans were feasible or fantasy. I took my time responding. I explained in clear but technical terms exactly what our current systems could handle and where we would hit limitations. I outlined what it would take to scale appropriately, what the risks were, what the timeline would look like, and what resources we would need. I spoke with confidence and precision, demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of our entire technical infrastructure that nobody else in that room possessed. When I finished, there was this pause, and I could see the realization dawning on several faces. They were beginning to understand that their entire business strategy was dependent on capabilities that I controlled. Margaret nodded thoughtfully and said, "Work up a detailed proposal for me. I want to understand exactly what we need to invest in to make this expansion successful." Richard tried to assert himself, saying something about how we would prepare the proposal together, but Margaret waved him off and said, "No, I want this directly from the source. I need the technical expert's assessment, not filtered through management." I almost smiled. Almost. That meeting changed everything in subtle but important ways. Suddenly, I was being invited to strategic planning sessions. Executives were reaching out to me directly instead of going through Richard. When major decisions needed to be made about technology investments or capability development, my opinion mattered. I wasn't getting a new title or a corner office or a huge raise yet, but I had gained something more valuable: direct access to power and the recognition that I was essential. Richard was not happy about this shift. I could see his frustration and insecurity growing as he watched me gain influence that he couldn't control. He started trying to reassert his authority, being more micromanaging with me, trying to insert himself into my communications with executives, attempting to take credit even more aggressively for work I was doing. But it was too late. The cat was out of the bag and people were beginning to see through his act. I remember one particularly satisfying moment when Richard tried to present one of my analysis reports in a meeting, and Margaret stopped him mid-sentence and said, "Actually, I'd like to hear this directly from who prepared it. The nuances are important." Richard had to sit down and let me present my own work, and I could feel his anger radiating across the conference table. But there was nothing he could do because Margaret had made it clear that she valued direct access to expertise over hierarchical presentation. These first signs of power were intoxicating. After years of being invisible and dismissed, I was finally being seen, finally being valued, finally being recognized for the contributions I had been making all along. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. I had gained attention and respect, but I didn't have real power yet. Real power would mean having leverage, having the ability to dictate terms, having a position so strong that they couldn't function without me, and I was determined to achieve that level of power. So even as I enjoyed these small victories, I continued building, continued making myself more indispensable, continued positioning myself for the ultimate checkmate that I knew was coming. The turning tables phase was when everything started accelerating in ways I couldn't have fully predicted, but had definitely prepared for. The company was experiencing rapid growth, which was exciting for everyone but also created enormous strain on our systems and infrastructure. We were onboarding new clients faster than we could scale our operations, hiring new employees every week, and expanding into markets we didn't fully understand yet. It was controlled chaos, and everyone was struggling to keep up with the pace of change. Except me. I thrived in this environment because I had anticipated it. All those late nights building scalable systems, all those hours learning about cloud architecture and automation, all that strategic thinking about how to create flexibility in our infrastructure, it was all paying off now. While everyone else was panicking about how to handle the growth, I was calmly implementing solutions I had already designed, months or years earlier. This was when I started to feel the shift from being valued to being truly powerful. People weren't just thanking me anymore, they were depending on me desperately. Every day brought new crises that only I could solve, new requirements that only I could fulfill, new strategic questions that only I could answer. I became the bottleneck, the critical path, the person whose availability determined whether projects could move forward or would stall, and I used that leverage brilliantly, if I may say so, not to hurt anyone or sabotage the company, but to finally start getting what I deserved. When Margaret approached me about a particularly critical project that needed to be completed on an aggressive timeline, I didn't just say yes like I would have in the old days. Instead, I negotiated. I told her that I could deliver what she needed, but that I would need additional resources. specifically 2 junior analysts who would work under my direct supervision. This was my first attempt at building a team, at moving from individual contributor to leader. Margaret agreed immediately, grateful that I was willing to take on the challenge. Just like that, I had reports for the first time in my career. I wasn't just an analyst anymore, I was becoming a manager, and Richard had nothing to say about it because the decision had come from above him. The 2 analysts I got were smart recent graduates who were eager to learn. I trained them carefully, teaching them parts of what I knew but never quite everything. I gave them real responsibilities and helped develop their skills, but I made sure that the core architecture, the critical understanding that made everything work, remained with me. They became force multipliers for my work, but they didn't become replacements for me. If anything, by expanding the scope of what we could accomplish, they made me even more essential. Around this time, we landed an enterprise client that was by far the biggest deal in our company's history. This client was a Fortune 500 company that wanted to implement our solutions across their entire global organization. The contract was worth tens of millions of dollars and would essentially guarantee our company's success for years to come. But there was a catch. This client had extremely sophisticated technical requirements and rigorous security standards. They wanted to conduct a thorough technical due diligence before signing the contract, which meant they would send their IT team to evaluate our capabilities in detail. This evaluation would determine whether the deal went through or fell apart. The pressure was immense. Everyone understood that landing this client would be transformative for the company. It would mean more funding, more growth, more opportunities for everyone. But failing to land it would be devastating, especially since we had already invested heavily in preparing for the expansion. Margaret called an emergency meeting with all the key people who would be involved in the technical evaluation. As I walked into that conference room, I realized something remarkable. Every single person in that room, from the CEO to the CTO to the head of sales, they were all there because they needed to understand what I would be presenting to the client's technical team. I wasn't just attending the meeting, I was the reason for the meeting. Richard was there too, sitting next to Margaret, trying to look important and in control. But when Margaret started the meeting, she looked directly at me and said, "Walk us through your plan for the technical evaluation. What are they going to review and are we ready?" I laid it all out. I explained our architecture, our security protocols, our scalability capabilities, our disaster recovery systems, all the technical infrastructure that I had built over the years. I outlined what the client's team would be looking for, what questions they would ask, what demonstrations we would need to provide. I spoke for over an hour, answering questions, addressing concerns, explaining complex technical concepts in ways that the non-technical executives could understand. By the end of my presentation, the mood in the room had shifted from anxiety to confidence. Margaret was smiling. The CTO was nodding approvingly. The head of sales looked relieved. They understood that we were actually in great shape for this evaluation, that we had the capabilities the client needed, and that I would be able to present them effectively. Then Margaret said something that changed my trajectory permanently. She said, "I want you leading this evaluation process. Report directly to me on this project. Whatever resources you need, whatever support, you've got it. This is our most important priority, and I'm putting our best person in charge of it." Our best person. She had called me our best person in front of the entire executive team. Richard's face was frozen in this forced smile that couldn't quite hide his fury. In that moment, I had been elevated above him, at least for this project, and there was nothing he could do about it. The technical evaluation was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During those 3 weeks, I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. But this time it was different because everyone knew I was working hard. I wasn't invisible anymore. People knew that I was carrying the company's most important project on my shoulders, and they treated me accordingly. Executives stopped me in the hallway to ask how things were going, expressing their confidence in me. Colleagues congratulated me on the opportunity. Even Richard, through gritted teeth, told me he was sure I would do great. I prepared for that evaluation like a lawyer preparing for the trial of their career. I anticipated every question, prepared every demonstration, assembled every piece of documentation they might want to review. I coordinated with different departments to make sure everyone was aligned on messaging. I even coached the executives on how to answer questions if they were asked directly by the client. When the day of the evaluation arrived, I was ready. The client sent a team of 5 people, all senior technical experts who had clearly done hundreds of these evaluations. They were thorough, skeptical, and relentlessly questioning. They spent 2 full days examining our systems, reviewing our code, testing our security protocols, and challenging our claims. And I handled every moment perfectly. I demonstrated our capabilities with confidence. I answered their technical questions with precision. When they found potential weaknesses, I acknowledged them honestly, but explained our mitigation strategies. I showed them the roadmap for future development, the innovations we were working on, the ways we were staying ahead of industry trends. By the end of the second day, I could see that we had won them over. The lead evaluator, a woman named Dr. Patterson, who had seemed impossibly demanding throughout the process, actually shook my hand and said, "This is one of the most impressive technical operations I've seen in a company your size. You clearly know what you're doing." 2 weeks later, the contract was signed. We had landed the biggest client in company history, and everyone knew that it was largely because of the technical evaluation I had led. Margaret sent out a company-wide email announcing the deal, and specifically thanking me by name for my exceptional work in securing the client's confidence. That email was a turning point. Suddenly, people I had never spoken to were congratulating me in the hallway. I was no longer invisible, I was visible to everyone, and what they saw was someone who had just delivered massive value to the company. The revelation moment came not in the dramatic way I had sometimes imagined during my years of quiet preparation, but rather in a series of escalating realizations that swept through the company like a slow-moving wave. It started with my performance review, which was scheduled about a month after we closed the enormous contract with the Fortune 500 client. I walked into Richard's office for what I expected to be the standard annual review, the same lukewarm feedback and modest raise I had received for years. But this time was different. This time, Richard looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. He started the review by acknowledging my recent contributions, specifically mentioning the successful technical evaluation. He said the company appreciated my work and that they were pleased with my performance. Then he offered me a raise, a real raise this time, nearly 20% increase in salary. A few years earlier, I would have been thrilled. I would have accepted gratefully and felt validated that finally, I was being recognized. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent too many years understanding the true extent of my value, and I knew that a 20% raise, while significant, was nowhere near what I deserved or what the company could afford now that we had landed such a massive contract. So I did something I had never done before. I said no. I told Richard that I appreciated the offer, but that it didn't reflect the actual value I had brought to the company. I laid it out clearly, calmly, without emotion. I explained that I had built virtually every critical system the company relied on. I noted that the recent contract, worth tens of millions of dollars, had been secured largely because of capabilities I had developed and evaluation I had led. I mentioned that I was now managing a team, taking on leadership responsibilities that went far beyond my current title and compensation. And then I said the words that would change everything. I said, "I think we both know that I'm underpaid and undervalued relative to my contributions. I'm not asking for recognition anymore. I'm stating a fact, and I think it's time we address that fact appropriately." Richard's face went through several expressions: surprise, annoyance, calculation. He clearly hadn't expected me to push back, to advocate for myself so directly. He tried to argue with me, saying things about company salary bands and budget constraints and the need to be fair to everyone. But I interrupted him, which I had also never done before, and I said something that I could see hit him like a physical blow. I said, "Richard, let's be honest with each other for once. You've been taking credit for my work for years. Everyone in the leadership team is starting to understand that the technical capabilities they value, the systems that run this company, the analyses that inform major decisions, they come from me, not from you. This isn't about what's fair according to some salary band. This is about recognizing reality. And the reality is that I have more leverage in this relationship than you want to admit." The silence that followed was profound. Richard stared at me, and I could see him processing what I had just said, understanding that the quiet analyst he had dismissed and exploited for years had transformed into someone who not only understood their own power, but was willing to wield it. He tried to recover, to reassert his authority, saying something about how he didn't appreciate my tone and that I should remember who I reported to. But we both knew the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I stood up, told him I would wait to hear a better offer, and walked out of his office. My heart was pounding, but I felt exhilarated. I had finally spoken my truth, finally confronted the person who had minimized me for so long, and I had done it from a position of strength. The next few days were tense. I continued doing my work, managing my team, handling the various projects I was responsible for, but I knew something was happening behind the scenes. I could sense the political maneuvering, the conversations about what to do about me, the calculations about my value versus the risk of my demands. Then Margaret called me into her office. This was it, I thought. Either they were going to meet my demands, or there would be some kind of confrontation. I prepared myself for either outcome, reminding myself that I had options, that I had built external credibility, that I could walk away if necessary. But when I sat down in Margaret's office, she surprised me. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before, something like respect mixed with concern. She said, "I've been talking to Richard about your review. He's frustrated with how that conversation went. But honestly, I'm more concerned about the things he told me you said, about how you believe you've been undervalued, about how your contributions haven't been properly recognized." I met her eyes and said, "It's not about what I believe, Margaret. It's about what's true. And I think you know it's true." She nodded slowly. "Tell me something. If we had tried to conduct that technical evaluation without you, what would have happened?" I could have been diplomatic, could have softened my answer, but I chose honesty instead. I said, "You would have failed. The client would have identified gaps in our capabilities that nobody else in this company could have explained or demonstrated effectively. They would have walked away, and we would have lost the biggest contract in our history." Margaret absorbed that. Then she asked, "And if you decided to leave the company tomorrow, what would happen to our operations?" Again, brutal honesty. Significant disruption. It would take months, maybe longer, to find someone with the knowledge to take over my systems. Some of the more complex automated processes might fail before they could be properly transitioned. You would need to hire multiple people to replace what I do, and even then there would be gaps. She sat back in her chair, processing what I was telling her. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled, not a happy smile, but a smile of recognition. She said, "You've been planning this, haven't you? Not in a malicious way, but strategically. You've made yourself essential, and now you're in a position to negotiate from strength." I didn't deny it. I just looked at her and said, "I've been working extremely hard for this company for years, building capabilities that have driven significant value. I didn't set out to make myself essential. I just did excellent work consistently. But yes, I've reached a point where I understand my value, and I'm no longer willing to accept being undercompensated and overlooked." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her thinking through the implications. Finally, she said, "What do you want? Let's stop dancing around this and get specific." This was the moment I had been building toward for years. I laid out my terms clearly. I wanted a promotion to director level, putting me on par with Richard organizationally. I wanted a compensation package that reflected my actual value to the company, including salary, bonus structure, and equity. I wanted formal recognition of the systems and capabilities I had built, and I wanted direct reporting to her, not to Richard, because that relationship had become untenable. Margaret listened to everything, and then she said something that told me I had won. She said, "I need to discuss this with the board, but I'm going to be honest with you. You're right. You've been undervalued, and we've been taking advantage of your willingness to work hard without demanding recognition. That was a mistake on our part, and good people leave companies because of mistakes like that. Give me a week to work this out, but I promise you, we're going to make this right." 1 week later, I had everything I had asked for and more. My new title was Director of Analytics and Technology Infrastructure. My compensation had more than doubled. I had a team of 6 people reporting to me, and most satisfyingly, I now reported directly to Margaret, completely bypassing Richard in the organizational hierarchy. The announcement of my promotion was made in an all-hands company meeting. Margaret herself presented it, explaining that the company was formalizing the leadership structure to reflect the critical importance of our technical capabilities. She praised my contributions, specifically mentioning several of the systems I had built and the role I had played in landing our biggest client. The applause that followed was genuine. People throughout the company congratulating me, many of them people I had worked with for years who were genuinely happy to see me recognized. but the best moment was seeing Richard's face during that announcement. He tried to maintain a professional expression, tried to clap along with everyone else, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. He understood what had happened. The person he had dismissed and exploited for years had not only surpassed him organizationally, but had done so in a way that exposed his own lack of real contribution. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The reality of the situation was vindication enough. The strategic moves that followed my promotion were about consolidating power and transforming my individual influence into institutional authority that couldn't be easily undermined or taken away. I understood that titles and compensation, while satisfying, weren't enough to ensure long-term security and impact. I needed to build an organization, a department, a structure that would extend my vision and capabilities throughout the company in ways that would outlast any individual project or initiative. The first thing I did was build my team strategically. I wasn't just looking for technical talent, though that was important. I was looking for people who were like I had been, undervalued in their previous positions, extremely talented but overlooked, hungry for opportunity and recognition. I found them in unexpected places. The quiet analyst at a competitor who was doing brilliant work that nobody noticed. The recent graduate with an impressive academic background who couldn't get hired because they lacked the social polish that impressed in interviews. The mid-career professional who had been pigeonholed in a narrow role and was desperate for a chance to show their broader capabilities. I recruited these people carefully, selling them not just on the job but on the vision of what we were building together. I told them that I valued substance over style, results over politics, and that if they worked hard and delivered excellent work, they would be recognized and rewarded. I promised them that they wouldn't be invisible in my organization, that their contributions would be acknowledged, that they would have opportunities to grow and develop. And I kept those promises. Within 6 months, I had built a team of 15 people who were absolutely loyal to me, because I treated them the way I had wished to be treated during my years of invisibility. I gave them challenging work, I defended them in meetings, I ensured they got credit for their accomplishments, and I fought for their compensation and advancement. In return, they worked incredibly hard and produced exceptional results. We became known throughout the company as the team that could solve impossible problems, that delivered on aggressive timelines, that brought innovative solutions to complex challenges. But I didn't just build a team, I built an empire. I systematically expanded my organization's responsibilities, taking on more and more of the company's critical technical infrastructure. When problems arose in other departments, problems that had technical components, I volunteered my team to help solve them. When new initiatives needed technical leadership, I made sure my people were the ones leading them. When the company considered outsourcing certain functions, I demonstrated how we could bring them in-house more effectively and cost-efficiently. Every successful project, every problem solved, every efficiency gained, it all added to my organization's credibility and expanded our domain. Within a year of my promotion, my department had grown from 6 people to 25 people. We were no longer just analytics and infrastructure. We were innovation, automation, data science, business intelligence, and strategic technology planning. We touched virtually every major initiative in the company, and our input was sought on every important decision. I also made sure to build strong alliances with other powerful people in the organization. I cultivated my relationship with Margaret, providing her with insights and analyses that made her look brilliant in board meetings. I became an invaluable resource to our CFO David, building financial forecasting models that gave him unprecedented visibility into company performance. I worked closely with our head of sales, creating tools that made his team more effective and helped them close deals faster. I wasn't just accumulating power for its own sake. I was using it to drive real value for the company. And because I was genuinely helping these executives succeed in their roles, they became invested in my success. They became my advocates, my protectors, my allies. When challenges arose, when there were budget discussions or organizational debates, I had powerful voices supporting my positions because they understood how much value my organization delivered. The transformation in how I was perceived throughout the company was remarkable. I went from being the invisible analyst to being one of the most respected and influential leaders in the organization. People sought my opinion on strategic questions. I was invited to board presentations to explain technical strategy. Industry publications interviewed me about our innovations. job candidates specifically mentioned wanting to work for me when they applied to the company. It was everything I had dreamed about during those dark years of being overlooked, and it was profoundly satisfying. But there was one piece of unfinished business that still gnawed at me, and that was Richard. After my promotion, Richard's position had become increasingly awkward. He was still a director, nominally at the same level as me in the hierarchy, but everyone knew that my star was rising while his was fading. The work that had made him look good for years had been revealed as not really his work at all. The technical capabilities he had claimed credit for were now clearly associated with me and my team. He still had his role, still managed some teams, but his influence was diminishing steadily. For several months we barely interacted. We were both reporting to Margaret, but we worked on different things and moved in different circles. I could have left it at that, could have been satisfied with my victory and ignored him. But I'm human, and I won't pretend I didn't feel some vindictive satisfaction at watching his decline. The situation came to a head during a strategic planning meeting about 9 months after my promotion. The company was considering a major pivot in our business model, moving from primarily selling software licenses to offering a full cloud-based platform as a service. This was a huge strategic decision that would require significant technical transformation, and Margaret had asked both Richard and me to assess the feasibility and present our recommendations. Richard went first. He gave a presentation that was clearly prepared by someone on his team who actually understood the technology. But when executives started asking detailed questions, he struggled. He used buzzwords and vague language, tried to deflect technical questions by saying he would need to get back to them with specifics, and generally demonstrated that he didn't really understand the implications of what he was proposing. I watched him struggle, and I felt this mixture of pity and satisfaction. Then it was my turn. I presented a comprehensive analysis that I had personally prepared with input from my team. I explained exactly what the transformation would require, what the risks were, what the timeline would be, what the costs would be, and what the potential upside was. I answered every technical question with precision. I acknowledged uncertainties honestly but explained how we would mitigate them. By the time I finished, it was clear to everyone in that room who actually understood the technology and who was just pretending. After the meeting, Margaret asked both Richard and me to stay. Once the room cleared, she looked at Richard with an expression that was almost sympathetic and said, "Richard, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your role in this organization." What followed was uncomfortable to witness, even given my complicated feelings about Richard. Margaret, in her characteristically direct way, explained that the company's technical sophistication had evolved beyond his capabilities. She acknowledged that he had contributed during earlier phases of the company's growth, but that the current needs required depth of expertise that he didn't possess. She offered him 2 options: accept a demotion to a project management role where he wouldn't need to represent technical capabilities he didn't have, or take a generous severance package and leave the company. The color drained from Richard's face. He tried to argue, tried to defend himself, tried to claim that I had undermined him politically. But Margaret cut him off and said something that I will never forget. She said, "This isn't about politics, Richard. This is about competence. And the truth is, you've been claiming credit for competence that belonged to someone else for years. That worked when the person doing the actual work was willing to stay in the background. But once they stepped forward and claimed their rightful recognition, the difference became obvious to everyone. You created this situation yourself through years of taking credit you didn't earn." Richard looked at me with pure hatred in that moment, as if I had orchestrated his downfall through some nefarious scheme. But I just looked back at him calmly and said nothing. Because Margaret was right, he had created this situation himself. I hadn't sabotaged him or lied about him or conspired against him. I had simply been excellent at my job, and eventually insisted on being recognized for it. His downfall was the natural consequence of his own choices to take credit he didn't deserve. Richard chose the severance package and left the company 2 weeks later. There was a brief, awkward farewell announcement, and then he was gone, erased from the organization as if he had never been there. His departure left a void in the management structure that was quickly filled by people from my team. The departments that had reported to him were reorganized under my leadership. Essentially, I absorbed his entire domain, becoming responsible for virtually all of the company's technical and analytical capabilities. That was the moment when I realized that I had achieved something extraordinary. I had gone from being invisible and powerless to being one of the most powerful people in the entire organization. I didn't just control systems and data anymore. I controlled strategy, resources, people, decisions. I had become exactly what I had set out to become during those long years of quiet preparation, essential, irreplaceable, and in control of their entire future. The confrontation that had been building for years reached its climax in ways that extended far beyond just Richard's departure. The truth is, once Richard left, there were others in the organization who felt threatened by my rising influence. People who had benefited from the old power structure, who had advanced through political maneuvering rather than merit, who understood that my approach to leadership, which valued substance and competence over schmoozing and self-promotion, represented a fundamental challenge to how they operated. There was a small group of mid-level managers and one VP who began a subtle campaign to undermine me. They couldn't attack my technical competence, which was beyond dispute, so they tried different tactics. They spread rumors that I was difficult to work with, that I was empire building without concern for the broader organization, that I was hoarding resources and information to maintain my own power. They tried to paint me as the villain in Richard's story, suggesting that I had been politically manipulative in pushing him out. These were the tactics of people who understood only one way of gaining power, through politics and perception management. What they didn't understand is that I had built something much more durable than a political coalition. I had built actual value, real capabilities, tangible results that spoke louder than any whisper campaign could undermine. The confrontation came to a head in an executive retreat that Margaret organized about a year after Richard's departure. These retreats were supposed to be strategic planning sessions where the leadership team aligned on company direction, but they often became political battlegrounds where different factions competed for resources and influence. The VP who had been leading the subtle campaign against me, his name was Stephen, decided to make his move during a session about organizational structure and resource allocation. He gave a presentation arguing that my department had become too large and too central to the organization, that it created a single point of failure, and that we should distribute technical capabilities across different departments rather than concentrating them under one leader. It was a clever argument because it was framed as being about organizational resilience rather than about me specifically. But everyone in that room understood what was really happening. Stephen was trying to break up my department, reduce my influence, and redistribute my resources to other parts of the organization where he had more influence. He probably thought he was being strategic, that he could diminish my power through structural changes rather than direct confrontation. But he had miscalculated badly. When Stephen finished his presentation, Margaret asked for my response. I stood up, and I delivered what was probably the most important speech of my entire career. I didn't get defensive. I didn't attack Stephen personally. Instead, I calmly and methodically explained the actual structure of our technical capabilities, why they were organized the way they were, what value that organization delivered, and what would happen if we tried to distribute those capabilities the way Stephen was suggesting. I used data, specific examples, and clear reasoning. I showed how the centralized structure actually enabled faster innovation, better collaboration, and more efficient use of resources. I demonstrated how my department had delivered measurable value, with specific numbers about cost savings, revenue enabled, and strategic capabilities developed. I explained how the deep expertise we had built would be impossible to replicate in a distributed model, and how Stephen's proposal would actually create more single points of failure, not fewer, because you would have semi-competent technical leadership in multiple places instead of deep expertise in one place. Then I did something that Stephen hadn't anticipated. I turned the conversation to results. I pulled up our company's performance metrics over the past 2 years and showed the correlation between initiatives led by my department and business outcomes. Revenue growth, client retention, operational efficiency, all of it had improved dramatically during the period when my organization had been growing and taking on more responsibility. Then I pulled up Stephen's department's metrics, which were not nearly as impressive. I didn't say anything judgmental, I just let the data speak for itself. The silence in that room was profound. Stephen had tried to make this about organizational theory and structure, but I had made it about results and value, and the results were incontrovertible. Margaret looked at Stephen and said, "Do you have a response to these points?" Stephen tried to argue, but his arguments sounded weak after my presentation. He fell back on vague concerns about concentration of power and organizational risk, but without data or specific examples, his arguments rang hollow. Other executives started asking him pointed questions that he couldn't answer effectively. It became clear that his proposal wasn't really about improving the organization. It was about political positioning. The confrontation didn't end there. Over the following weeks, Stephen continued to try to build opposition to me, but his failed power play at the retreat had damaged his credibility. People started avoiding association with him because being seen as opposing me, who had delivered such obvious value, was politically dangerous for them. Eventually, Stephen himself ended up leaving the company, though unlike Richard, he left on his own initiative, probably recognizing that his position had become untenable. His departure was another turning point. It sent a message throughout the organization that competence and results mattered more than political maneuvering, that the old ways of advancing through networking and self-promotion alone weren't sufficient anymore. People who had been quietly excellent at their jobs but overlooked, people like I had been years ago, suddenly felt empowered to speak up and claim recognition for their contributions. In some ways, I had started a small revolution in the company culture. The organization began rewarding substance over style, promoting people who delivered results rather than people who were just good at managing up. And because I was visibly succeeding with this approach, others felt encouraged to adopt it as well. It wasn't all positive, I'll admit. Some people genuinely resented my influence and felt that I had become the thing I had once opposed, a power-hoarding leader who controlled too much. There were people who left the company because they felt there was no longer room for them to advance in areas I controlled. There were whispered criticisms that I had become arrogant, that success had changed me in negative ways, and maybe there was some truth to that. Maybe I had become more confident, more assertive, more willing to wield power directly rather than operate in the shadows. Maybe the years of being overlooked had created in me a hunger for recognition that was never fully satisfied, no matter how much I achieved. But I also genuinely believed that I was using my power well, that I was building something valuable, that I was creating opportunities for talented people who might otherwise be overlooked. My department became known as a place where merit mattered, where hard work was rewarded, where excellent technical work led to career advancement. We had almost zero turnover because people felt valued and challenged and fairly compensated, and we continued to deliver exceptional results for the company, driving innovation and growth in ways that justified the resources and trust that had been invested in us. The confrontations with Richard and Stephen taught me important lessons about power and how to maintain it. I learned that power based on competence and results is more durable than power based on politics and perception. I learned that the best defense against people trying to undermine you is to be so obviously valuable that attacking you damages the attacker's credibility more than yours. I learned that you can be strong and assertive without being cruel or vindictive, that you can claim your rightful recognition without diminishing others unnecessarily. But I also learned that once you have power, you will always have people trying to take it from you. People who resent your success or want what you have or simply believe they could do better. Maintaining power requires constant vigilance, constant delivery of results, constant relationship building with allies who can support you when challenges arise. It's exhausting sometimes, much more exhausting than those quiet years when I was invisible and nobody expected anything from me. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of just doing good work without having to manage politics and navigate organizational dynamics and defend my position against challenges. But then I remember what it felt like to be overlooked, to watch others take credit for my work, to feel invisible and powerless and unvalued. And I know that I would never go back to that the burden of power is worth it because the alternative, powerlessness, is so much worse. The aftermath of these confrontations and power shifts left me in a position I had barely dared to imagine during those early years of quiet resentment and strategic planning. I was now not just a director but a senior vice president, with a title change that Margaret had pushed through after Stephen's departure. My department had grown to over 40 people. I sat in every major strategic discussion. My opinion carried weight on decisions that extended far beyond just technology and analytics. I had become, by any measure, one of the most powerful and influential people in the entire organization. But power, I discovered, is a strange thing. The more you have of it, the more you become aware of its limitations. I could control systems and resources and organizational structure, but I couldn't control how people perceived me, how they talked about me when I wasn't in the room, how my story was told and retold throughout the company. There were people who admired my rise and saw me as an inspiration, proof that merit and hard work could overcome being overlooked and underestimated. These were usually people who identified with my story, who had themselves felt invisible or dismissed at some point. They would come to me with their own stories, telling me about situations where they weren't being recognized for their contributions, asking for advice on how to advocate for themselves. I tried to help when I could, to mentor and guide, to pay forward the hard-earned wisdom I had gained. But there were also people who saw me differently, who told a darker version of my story. In their narrative, I was the manipulator, the schemer, the person who had deliberately created organizational dependencies to make myself indispensable. They whispered that I had sabotaged Richard rather than simply outperformed him, that I had engineered Stephen's departure through political machinations. They painted me as someone who valued power over collaboration, control over partnership. Some of this criticism wasn't entirely unfair, I'll admit. I had been calculating and strategic in how I built my position. I had created dependencies deliberately. I had used information and access as leverage. I hadn't sabotaged anyone or acted unethically, but I also hadn't been entirely transparent about my long-term planning. I had played a long game that involved years of strategic positioning, and not everyone appreciated being pawns in that game, even inadvertently. Margaret and I had several deep conversations during this period about leadership and power, and the responsibilities that came with influence. She understood better than anyone how I had risen to my position, because she had watched the entire journey, and she had her own complicated feelings about it. On one hand, she valued the capabilities I had built and the results I delivered. My department was a competitive advantage for the company, and my leadership had genuinely improved our technical sophistication and operational efficiency. On the other hand, she worried about organizational risk, about what would happen if I left, or if something happened to me, about whether I had become too powerful for the long-term health of the company. She said to me once during a particularly honest late-night conversation after a board meeting, "You know, when I said you control their entire future, I was talking about the company's future, not just individuals. That's a tremendous amount of responsibility. It's also a tremendous amount of risk. Have you thought about what happens if you're not here? Have you thought about succession planning and knowledge transfer, and ensuring that what you've built can outlast you?" These were hard questions, questions I hadn't wanted to fully confront, because they touched on my deepest insecurities. The truth was, I had made myself essential partly because being essential felt like security, like protection against ever being overlooked or discarded again. The idea of making myself less essential, of distributing my knowledge and capabilities to the point where I could be replaced, that terrified me at a visceral level. But Margaret was right, and I knew it. So I began the difficult work of institutionalizing my knowledge, of building systems and processes and training programs that would allow others to understand and maintain what I had created. I started documenting everything in more accessible ways. I began training senior people on my team to handle responsibilities I had previously kept to myself. I created redundancies and backup plans. It was counterintuitive and emotionally difficult, deliberately reducing my own indispensability after spending years building it, but it was the right thing to do, not just for the company but for my own growth as a leader. During this period, I also started to reckon with the personal costs of my single-minded focus on professional vindication. I was in my mid-30s now, financially successful and professionally powerful but personally somewhat isolated. The relationships I had sacrificed during my years of obsessive preparation, they hadn't been magically restored by my success. My dating life was virtually non-existent because I had been so consumed by work. My friendships outside of professional contexts had atrophied. My family was proud of my success but also somewhat distant, unsure how to relate to this new version of me, who spoke confidently about strategy and leadership rather than quietly accepting life's disappointments. I remember having dinner with my mother during this time, trying to explain what I had achieved and why it mattered. She listened patiently, and then said something that cut through all my professional accomplishment like a knife. She said, "Honey, I'm proud of you, truly. But I worry that you've spent so many years being angry about how you were treated, that you've forgotten how to be happy. Have you achieved what you wanted? Are you satisfied now? Because from where I'm sitting, You seem just as driven and unsettled as you were when you were that overlooked analyst." She was right. Annoyingly, perfectly right. I had achieved everything I had set out to achieve professionally. I had gone from invisible to indispensable, from powerless to powerful, from dismissed to respected. I had shown everyone who had underestimated me that they were wrong, that I was capable of far more than they had imagined. But had it made me happy? Had vindication delivered the emotional satisfaction I had assumed it would? The honest answer was complicated. There was satisfaction, definitely. There was a sense of justice in having my contributions finally recognized. There was pleasure in the financial security and the professional respect. But there was also this lingering restlessness, this sense that no amount of external validation could fully heal the wounds that had been created during those years of being overlooked. I had been carrying anger and hurt for so long that I wasn't sure who I would be without them. So I started doing some difficult internal work. With the help of a therapist, I finally allowed myself to see regularly. I began processing not just what had been done to me, but also what I had done in response. The costs and benefits of my strategic approach to career advancement. I started to examine why being overlooked had hurt so deeply, what that said about my own sense of worth and where I derived my self-esteem. I began to understand that true power isn't just about controlling external circumstances. It's also about having enough internal security that you don't need to control external circumstances to feel okay about yourself. This realization didn't diminish my professional ambitions or my enjoyment of the influence I had built, but it added a layer of perspective that made me a better leader, and, I think, a better person. I started approaching my work with less ego attachment, focusing more on building sustainable systems and developing other people rather than on proving my own indispensability. I began to use my power more generously, to advocate for others who were being overlooked, to create opportunities for people who reminded me of my younger self. The company continued to grow and evolve, and my role evolved with it. We went public about 18 months after Stephen's departure, a milestone that made many of us financially comfortable beyond what we had imagined. The IPO was successful largely because of the strong technical foundation and data-driven culture that my department had helped establish. During the roadshow presentations to investors, I was featured prominently, explaining our technical capabilities and competitive advantages. It was surreal to think back to those days when Richard had presented my work as his own. And now here I was, on stage in front of institutional investors, being recognized as a key asset of the company. But you know what was even more satisfying than the IPO or the financial windfall or the recognition? It was watching the people on my team succeed and advance. Several of them got promoted to director roles. A couple started their own companies with my mentorship and support. One was recruited to be the CTO of a major tech company, and while I was sorry to lose them, I was incredibly proud that someone I had trained and developed was getting such an amazing opportunity. That felt like power too, but a different kind of power. Not the power of control, but the power of influence and legacy, knowing that I had helped talented people reach their potential in ways that nobody had helped me during my early years. As I sit here now, reflecting on this entire journey from that dismissed analyst to where I am today, I feel a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, definitely. Satisfaction in having proven my worth. Relief at never having to feel invisible or powerless again. But also humility about how much my identity had become wrapped up in this narrative of vindication, and gratitude for the opportunities I've had to grow beyond that narrative into something more mature and balanced. The new reality I'm living now is so different from what I imagined during those dark years of plotting my rise to power that sometimes I barely recognize the person I've become. I'm now the Chief Technology Officer of a publicly traded company that employs over 300 people, and my department represents nearly a third of that workforce. We've expanded our technical capabilities to the point where other companies in our industry study our approach and try to replicate our innovations. I speak at conferences. I'm quoted in industry publications, and I've been approached by venture capital firms who want me to help evaluate their potential investments in tech companies. The transformation from invisible analyst to industry expert is so complete that sometimes I wonder if I dreamed those early years of being overlooked and dismissed. But I didn't dream them, and I carry the lessons from that experience with me every single day. Those lessons shape how I lead, how I treat people, how I think about power and influence and what it means to be successful. I've learned that being underestimated can be either a prison or a strategic advantage, depending on how you respond to it. I've learned that real power comes not from hiding your capabilities or from aggressively promoting yourself, but from consistently delivering value that becomes undeniable over time. I've learned that vindication, while sweet, is not the same as healing, and that you have to do the internal work of processing your wounds regardless of your external success. Most importantly, I've learned that the way you gain power matters just as much as gaining power itself. I could have risen to my current position by being ruthless and destructive, by truly sabotaging others and manipulating situations in harmful ways. But I chose a different path, one focused on building genuine value and competence, and that choice has made all the difference. My power is secure not because people fear me, but because they recognize that I contribute real value. They may not all like me, and certainly some resent my influence, but they respect what I've built and what I continue to deliver. Looking back at the entire journey, from that Tuesday afternoon when I realized I was tired of being invisible to this moment right now, I see a story that's both uniquely mine and surprisingly universal. How many people are sitting in offices right now, feeling overlooked and underestimated, wondering if they'll ever get the recognition they deserve? How many talented people are being dismissed by managers who don't understand their value or take credit for their work? How many quiet, competent individuals are building capabilities that others don't even notice, waiting for their moment to step into the light? If you're one of those people, if my story resonates with you because you've felt that same frustration and invisibility, then I want to tell you something important. Your situation is not permanent. Being underestimated is not a life sentence. You have more power than you realize to change your circumstances, to build value that cannot be ignored, to position yourself for the recognition you deserve. But I also want to caution you against making the mistakes I made along the way. Don't let your resentment consume you. Don't sacrifice your personal life and relationships for professional vindication. Don't become so focused on proving others wrong that you forget to build a life that actually makes you happy. Success is important, recognition matters, but they're not everything. The healthiest version of my story would have involved me advocating for myself earlier, setting boundaries with Richard from the beginning, finding a better work environment if necessary, rather than spending years in strategic silence building toward a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't the clever long-term manipulation, it's the direct, honest conversation where you state your worth and demand appropriate treatment. Sometimes walking away from a toxic situation is stronger than enduring it to prove a point. I want you to understand that while I don't regret my journey, and while I'm proud of where I've ended up, there were costs that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Years of my life spent in anger and calculation that could have been spent building joy and connection. Relationships that withered because I was too focused on my professional goals. A version of myself that became harder and more cynical than I needed to be. These costs were real, and they mattered, even if the outcome was ultimately positive. So, yes, they thought I was weak, and I showed them I control their entire future. That's a satisfying narrative, a story of vindication and triumph. But the fuller truth is more nuanced. I showed them my strength, yes, but I also had to learn what to do with that strength once I had it. I had to learn that controlling others' futures is not as fulfilling as helping them build better futures. I had to learn that being seen is wonderful, but seeing yourself clearly is more important. I had to learn that the person you become in pursuit of power matters more than the power itself. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, that invisible analyst sitting in meetings being talked over and dismissed, I would tell him that his instincts about building competence and value were right, but that he should also work on building confidence and communication skills earlier. I would tell him to document his contributions, not just for strategic purposes, but to build a clear record of his professional growth. I would tell him to have the difficult conversations sooner, to advocate for himself more directly, to consider changing jobs if his environment was truly toxic, rather than staying out of some misguided sense that enduring mistreatment would make the eventual triumph more meaningful. But I would also tell him that he was stronger than he knew, that his patience and strategic thinking were valuable traits, that his deep competence and integrity would eventually be recognized. I would tell him that being underestimated by others says more about their failures of perception than about his actual capabilities. I would tell him to be kinder to himself during the difficult years, to maintain his relationships and hobbies and sources of joy outside of work, to remember that his worth as a person isn't determined by his professional success or failure, The most profound lesson I've learned from this entire experience is that true power isn't about control. It's about influence. It's about building things that matter, developing people who will carry your values forward, creating systems and cultures that outlast your individual contribution. The power I have now isn't really mine. It belongs to the organization and the team we've built together. My job is to steward it well, to use it to create value and opportunity, to ensure that the people coming after me have better experiences than I did in my early years. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you felt underestimated and then found your way to recognition? Or are you in the middle of that journey right now, trying to figure out how to claim your worth in a world that doesn't always see it clearly? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share your experiences, your struggles, your victories. Let's build a community of people who understand what it's like to be overlooked and who are committed to changing that reality, both for ourselves and for others. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your own experience or gave you hope or perspective or validation, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, more people who might need to hear that being underestimated doesn't define your future, that quiet strength can become obvious power, that your worth will eventually be recognized if you persist in building real value. Subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more stories like this one, stories about transformation and vindication, and the complex reality of human ambition and growth. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Because these aren't just entertainment, these are reflections of real human experiences, reminders that we're not alone in our struggles, inspiration for how we might navigate our own challenging situations. Remember, the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. They're giving you the gift of low expectations, which means you can exceed them dramatically. They're giving you the gift of operating without scrutiny, which allows you to build capabilities they don't see coming. They're giving you the gift of undervaluing your contributions, which means that when you finally claim appropriate recognition, the contrast is undeniable. So don't just prove them wrong, prove yourself right. Build something real, something valuable, something that cannot be ignored or dismissed or stolen. Build your competence, your integrity, your network of allies who see your worth. Build your confidence and your voice. Build your escape routes and your options. Build the life you actually want, not just the vindication you think you need. And when you finally step into the light, when the recognition comes and the power is yours, use it wisely. Use it to help others who are where you once were. Use it to build systems and cultures that value substance over style, merit over politics, quiet competence over loud self-promotion. Use it to become the leader you needed when you were struggling in obscurity. That's the real triumph, not just rising from weakness to power, but using that power to make the journey easier for those who come after you. That's how you transform a personal vindication story into something larger and more meaningful. That's how you ensure that your struggle wasn't just about you, but about changing the systems and cultures that create these unnecessary struggles in the first place. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for seeing me just as I see you. We're all on this journey together, trying to claim our worth in a world that doesn't always make it easy. But together, sharing our stories and supporting each other, we can make it a little easier for everyone. Keep building, keep growing, keep claiming your power. You're stronger than you know, and your moment is coming.